In this video, we are going to take a look at animals that have specialized tissues. So they are eumetazoa. They have bilateral symmetry and they are triploblastic. They are deuterostomes. And then they come in some different varieties. And so we're going to take a look at phylum Echinoderma and phylum Chordata. And we're just going to take a kind of a minimal look at the phylum Chordata because it includes both invertebrates and vertebrates. So there are some that are invertebrates, but then some of them that are vertebrates. And the vertebrates we're going to talk about in a different lesson. So first let's take a look at the deuterostomes. And so this is a superphylum. And the deuterostomes, the word means second mouth. And so if you recall, during embryonic development, you have gastrulation occurring, where the blastula starts to kind of cave in on one side. Now, in protostomes, which we've talked about before, that blastopore forms a mouth. And eventually that blastopore will go all the way through in order to create kind of a tunnel, almost like a donut. And the other end will be the anus. In deuterostomes, the blastopore forms the anus, and then the other end, when it forms that donut-like structure, will be the mouth. So the mouth is formed second, the anus is formed first. Deuterostomes also have an endoskeleton. So endo means inside, as opposed to an exoskeleton. Within the superphylum of Deuterostomia, we do have two phyla. We have phylum Echinodermata and phylum Chordata. And some of the organisms in Chordata are invertebrates, and some of them are vertebrates. And we are going to talk about the vertebrates in the next chapter. So we're only going to kind of introduce phylum Chordata in this video here. The organisms in phylum Echinodermata include things like sea stars. These used to be called starfish. But just like the jellies, they are not fish. And so the more current term is to call them sea stars. There are also sea urchins, sand dollars, brittle stars, sea lilies, and sea cucumbers. And so in this picture here, you can see the sea star. This is a brittle star. This is an urchin. This is a sea lily. And this is a sea cucumber. The sand dollars are not shown here, but you're probably familiar with the sand dollar if you've ever been on the beach or been to a store that sells shells. Now the word echinoderm means spiny or prickly skin. So derm should make you think of skin. And the echino means spiny or prickly. The organisms in this phylum have this interesting pentaradial symmetry. So penta means 5, and radial means kind of around. So you can see that a sea star has 5 arms to it. You can see the brittle star also has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a little less obvious in something like a sea urchin, but if you were to look at the skeleton of a sea urchin, you would be able to see that pentaradial symmetry a little bit better. They do not have cephalization, so there's no distinct head region. And they do have a nerve ring, but they don't have a brain and not a very well-developed nervous system. As mentioned before, these organisms have an endoskeleton. Endo means inside, so the skeleton is inside the skin. They have these tiny bones called ossicles that are covered by the epidermis. And so you can see here, so this picture is showing you the endoskeleton. And this is a dead sea urchin. So that's what basically this organism looks like after it has died and lost its skin and spines. They are covered in these spines that can either move around or they might be locked in place for defense. And it's interesting because these, especially these sea urchins, they actually will sometimes pick up things like rocks or algae to kind of cover themselves to either help camouflage themselves or maybe protect themselves from UV radiation or from predators. And if you haven't seen it before, if you go Google sea urchins in hats, it is quite possibly one of the cutest things you've ever seen. In a aquarium, they 3D printed these little hats and they put them in the urchin aquarium. And the urchins can't tell the difference between a cowboy hat and a rock. And so they would actually pick up the hats like rocks and kind of move them and put them on top of themselves. And like I said, it's adorable. So you need to go Google sea urchin hat and you will see the pictures and it's hilarious. Organisms in Echinodermata also have these tube feet, which you can see kind of sticking out on this picture here. This is a sea star arm, so kind of the end of the arm. And these 2 feet, they have these kind of little, almost the ability to suction at the end. If you've ever held a sea star for any period of time, if you were to flip your hand over, it'll stay stuck to you. You have to kind of like peel it off, almost like a little suction cup. And so these 2 feet help with moving around. It helps with feeding, so they can basically attach to prey and then move that prey towards their mouth. They also have some chemosensation, so it kind of acts like a smell or taste organ. And it also helps them to attach to substrates. And so you often find these echinoderms in the intertidal area, so kind of the area on a beach where the tide comes and goes. And this is a really high energy area, and they're able to stick themselves really hard onto rocks in order to prevent being carried away by the tide going in and out. They also have an interesting way of feeding. The mouth is on the ventral side, or the side that is typically facing down or towards the substrate. And what they do, they can actually take their stomach, really, and they can take their stomach and pull it out of their mouth to grab onto prey. And they kind of digest the prey with their stomach outside of their body, and then they can pull their stomach back in and absorb the nutrients. So this is actually a sea star here, and it's feeding on a bivalve of some sort. And the stomach has like a really strong muscle to it. And so the stomach can actually kind of flatten itself and stick itself inside the open end of a bivalve. And then they can essentially put their stomach into the middle of the bivalve, digest the bivalve from the inside out, so basically within the shell, and then retract its stomach and absorb the nutrients. And so it's just, to me, it's just fascinating how they do this. So it's like, imagine if you were to take your stomach, pull it up through your throat and out your mouth to kind of wrap it around your pizza or whatever you're eating. And then once it's broken down, you put the stomach back in your body to then allow the nutrients to be absorbed. Echinoderms can reproduce asexually or sexually. They can regenerate lost limbs. So if you ever see a starfish that only has 4 legs, it's possible that it's growing a 5th leg back. It can also reproduce by fragmentation. And so if part of the echinoderm breaks off, it, depending on if it has enough of the kind of the center area present, it can actually develop into its own organism. So I think you could technically take an echinoderm, cut it into 5 equal pieces and end up with 5 new echinoderms forming, because basically each leg and part of the center portion will develop into its own organism. They also do sexual reproduction. They are dioecious, meaning that they have different male and female organisms, but they are indistinguishable from each other unless you were to look at the gonads inside. So if you just go out to the beach and pick up an urchin or a sea cucumber or a sea star, you're not going to be able to tell which ones are males and which ones are females. Fertilization does occur externally. So the gametes, remember gametes are the sex cells, and so they are the eggs and sperm, are released into the water where they then hopefully find each other and produce a zygote. The other phylum in the superphylum Deuterostomia are the chordates, or phylum Chordata. And some of the key characteristics of chordates are that they have a notochord. And this notochord is kind of like a precursor to a spinal cord. So a spine or vertebral column. Precursor. They also have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, which is kind of like a precursor to a spinal cord. They also have pharyngeal slits. Sorry for the typo, that should say slits, which are kind of like a gill in a way. And a post-anal tail. So it doesn't show the anus here, but the anus would be before the tail. And then the tail is after the anus. As we mentioned before, phylum Chordata includes both invertebrates and vertebrates. So for the invertebrates, some of the subphyla include Urochordata, which are also known as tunicates, and subphylum Cephalochordata, which includes the lancelets. And these are filter feeders that typically stay buried or kind of embedded in the substrate. Vertebrates are also part of phylum Chordata, but we're going to cover them in their own lesson.